Does Wyoming live up to its nickname as the Equality State? It certainly seems to have earned the moniker historically. It was the first state to permanently pass women's suffrage into law, and it had the country's first female governor, Nellie Tayloe Ross. But in the present day, it's not exactly a shining example of gender equality. Its state legislature has less gender parity than all but 5 other states, and it hasn't elected a female governor since Tayloe Ross almost a century ago. And it's not just in public office. A 2019 analysis from the US Census Bureau's American Community Survey identified Wyoming as the worst state in the country for the gender wage gap, with women earning 63 cents for every dollar a man earns. The state boasts some proud history, and its nature looks like someone Google image searched heaven. But as Morgan Brindley suggested in a piece for Bustle back in 2016, the Equality State label may be more aspirational than descriptive today. Hi, I'm Justin Dodd. Welcome to Misconceptions. Today, I'm debunking one myth about each state in the US of A, from the Rocky Mountains not so high of Colorado to Missouri. Just Missouri. You forgot about Missouri, didn't you? Milwaukeeans pronounce the L. What is the biggest city in Wisconsin? If you said Milwaukee, you might not fit in with the locals. The more common pronunciation drops the L sound and might even smush the name into 2 syllables, more like Milwaukee. Of course, as Alice Cooper taught us in the film Wayne's World, the name really comes from an indigenous language in the region. It might originally have been pronounced more like Milwaukee. Couple bonus misconceptions there. The real pronunciation might be more like Minnowaki, and while Alice says it comes from the Algonquin, it's more likely from terms originating in the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Menominee languages, according to the Milwaukee Public Library. Those languages are considered Algonquian, a language group that derives its name from the Algonquin tribe, but that's not synonymous with it. West Virginia is part of Virginia. Our next state is West Virginia, which is also our next misconception. It's a state, not a part of Virginia, or as some may call it, regular Virginia. Shout out to the legend Margaret Shelton. This was a new one for me, but it was mentioned by a couple of people in response to our call for misconceptions on social media. I'm gonna say pretty much all of our American audience members know that West Virginia is a state, but you might not know why and how it came to be. Here's the short-ish version. The part of Virginia that eventually became West Virginia is pretty geographically distinct from its counterpart to the east. Instead of large swaths of flat land suitable for farming, it's dominated by mountain ranges. Over 1,000 named mountains are in the state. That innate difference helped lead to what many Western Virginians felt was a political imbalance, with plantation owners in the flatter part of the state wielding most of the power and further enriching themselves off of enslaved labor. Western Virginians felt overtaxed and underserved. 1861's Wheeling Convention paved the way for a new state. Since the split happened during the Civil War, you might assume that it was all about abolitionist West Virginia taking a moral stand against their pro-slavery neighbors. That's not really the case though. In the West, the idea of abolition was divisive, not an animating factor. Virginia's secession was more like a final blow in a geographic rift that had been developing for decades. On June 20th, 1863, the US federal government recognized West Virginia as a state. In his inaugural speech as its first governor, Arthur Boreman said of his former state mates to the east, "They had an unjust majority in the legislature and have clung to it with the utmost tenacity. They have collected heavy taxes from us and have spent large sums in the construction of railroads and canals in the east, but have withheld appropriations from the west." Things might not be quite as heated between the east and west today, but West Virginians would probably appreciate it if you would remember that they have their own state. All of Washington is rainy. Seattle can definitely be rainy. On average, more than 40% of the days in a year see some precipitation in the city. If you measure by total rainfall though, it's roughly 36 inches of annual precipitation. It's not that impressive. New York City sees around 50 inches of rain a year. Mobile, Alabama is clocking in at nearly 66. Compared to some parts of Washington though, Seattle is practically a water park. The eastern part of the state is quite dry, with many areas seeing as little as 6 or 7 inches of rain a year. A town called Mattawa averaged less than 5 inches of rain between 2008 and 2020. That's roughly on par with that lush, verdant wonderland, Las Vegas. Virginia is full of uneducated country bumpkins. If you spend enough time in the Big Apple, where mental floss is based, you're bound to hear someone get a little snooty on the subject of education in the South. It is true for a host of reasons that some of the states that struggle most with education in our country are below the Mason-Dixon line. But a healthy dose of humility would do my fellow Yankees, born and transplanted, pretty well. Obviously, there are intelligent people anywhere you go, and perhaps no southern state disproves the stereotypes of the uneducated South as much as Virginia. More than 38% of adults in the state have attained a bachelor's degree or higher, good for 7th best in the country. The state also boasts some impressive colleges and universities. William and Mary is the second oldest institute of higher learning established in the US and has alumni including Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, and Beth Comstock, who helped to develop Hulu. Without her, we might not have hundreds of hours of Love Island available for streaming right now. Scary thought. Then you've got UVA, founded by Thomas Jefferson, Hampton University, one of the country's top-rated HBCUs, VCU, Virginia Tech. The list goes on. Virginia students do well on standardized tests too, with above-average participation rates and scores on the SATs. Vermont is pushing wealthy people out. Vermont has been referred to as America's most European state. It elected a Democratic Socialist senator, for example, and boasts of a relatively strong social safety net that has contributed to high marks for childhood health and well-being. To help pay for that safety net, Vermonters pay more in taxes on average than residents of any other state, according to USA Today. Vermont's population has been static or even shrinking for years, with some pointing towards those high taxes as a reason. As State Senator Anthony Polina said, "I constantly hear stories in committee and on the floor of the Senate that we're pushing wealthier people out." The reality is more complicated. In Polina's understanding, in fact, the opposite is true. The state seems to be hemorrhaging low and middle income residents. According to an analysis conducted by the Vermont Legislative Joint Fiscal Office, Vermont actually saw a net gain of 126 high income taxpayers between 2012 and 2016. While the highest rate of out-migration occurred in 45 to 64-year-olds who make between $25,000 and $75,000 a year. It's hard to pin down any one reason for this trend. An informal survey conducted on Facebook saw former Vermonters mention taxes, the weather, job opportunities, and more as reasons for their move. Everyone in Utah is a bigamy-practicing Mormon. Like a lot of these misconceptions, this one begins with an element of truth. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints obviously plays a big role in the Beehive State, but not quite as big as it once did. Back in 1990, 72% of Utahns were Mormon. Today, that number is more like 62%. And this demographic shift is more pronounced in cities. By 2018, for the first time since at least the 1930s, the population of Salt Lake County became majority non-Mormon. As for the whole notion of sister wives, it's not a complete fabrication, but it's also far from the norm. In the late 1800s, the church was under increasing pressure from the federal government. 1887's Edmunds-Tucker Act took aim at polygamy and specifically disincorporated the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for its stance on the practice. Facing the loss of its property and jail time for practicing polygamists, who incidentally were probably a small minority of the faith even then, Church President Wilford Woodruff issued the so-called Manifesto. It officially banned polygamy in the church. A later declaration dubbed the Second Manifesto, no points for creativity there, strengthened that position. Church members who violate the prohibition can actually be excommunicated. Now, I will say, according to our research, devout believers' attitudes towards the practice of what's sometimes called plural marriages in a hypothetical afterlife are complicated, to say the least. But here on Earth, it's estimated that only around 40,000 fundamentalist Mormons engage in the illegal practice. Texas is full of cowboys. Is Texas the cowboy state? Well, yes and no. To start off with some good old-fashioned misconceptions pedantry, I'll note that it's Wyoming that calls itself the cowboy state. But that's really beside the point. doesn't everyone in Texas wear 10-gallon hats and cowboy boots and cook beans around the campfire? I might be describing a scene from Blazing Saddles, but that sure feels like Texas. Of course, with a state as large and geographically diverse as Texas, any stereotype is bound to get seriously tested. In cosmopolitan Austin, farming and ranching don't crack the top 50 most popular jobs. If you see someone walking down the street in a wide-brimmed hat, it's about as likely to be a cowboy as someone dressing up like Eli Cash for a Wes Anderson-themed costume party. Wildcat. Now, don't get me wrong, many cowboys are alive and well in the Lone Star State. With influence from Mexican Vaquero culture and a unique flavor of their own, plenty of Texans sport the boots, denim, hat trio you probably have in your mind, whether they work on a ranch or not. With some 13 million cattle in the state, plenty of people are making their living off that multi-billion-dollar industry. Still, all told, agriculture accounts for less than 2% of the state's GDP, much less than oil and gas. Texas also boasts growing sectors in technology, business services, and education. And lots of cowboys don't even wear boots. Tennessee is all country all the time. Some people call Nashville the country music capital of the world, but its other nickname, Music City, may be more fitting. Luminaries from the city and the state at large span practically every musical genre. Bessie Smith, the Empress of the Blues, pop acts like Justin Timberlake, hip-hop group 3 6 Mafia of Hustle and Flow fame, not to mention the genre-spanning icon Tina Turner. With venues like Ryman Auditorium, which has been called the Mother Church of country music, it's easy to see why people associate the state with country. But Tennessee's rich music culture has always been about more than just one genre. And shout out Hattie B's. You're delicious and painful, and I love you. South Dakota's only geographic rivalry is with North Dakota. As some social media commenters pointed out to us, South Dakota is not part of the same state as North Dakota. Seems kinda obvious, but apparently that mistake is common enough for people to be sick of hearing about it. But people in South Dakota also have a bit of an east-west rivalry, which I, for one, had never even heard about. In this case, the dividing line isn't a state border, but the Missouri River, which splits the state roughly in half. East River, as it's called, tends to have more farms. West River has more ranches. Think corn versus cows. In general, West River tends to lean more into its Wild West heritage. Deadwood, the town that inspired my personal favorite TV show of all time, is at the far western side of the state, while East River is flatter and slightly more urbanized and does not have a legacy HBO show that was unfortunately canceled too soon based off of it. South Carolina's military history started at Fort Sumter. South Carolina undoubtedly played a key role in the American Civil War. In late 1860, it became the first state to secede from the Union. When Abraham Lincoln tried to resupply Fort Sumter in 1861, it became the site of the first military engagement between Northern and Southern soldiers. The battle pitted Union forces led by Major Robert Anderson against Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard's Confederate troops. I remember covering, I'm gonna say at least 50% of that information in high school history class. But what I don't remember ever hearing is the key role South Carolina played in the American Revolution. The Southern colony was the setting for more than 200 battles, by some accounts more than any other colony. Many of these fights were smaller skirmishes, but the state was also the setting for major turning points like the Battle of Cowpens and the Battle of Kings Mountain, which Thomas Jefferson called the turn of the tide of success. In total, around 20% of the war's battlefield deaths happened in South Carolina. Rhode Island is a part of New York. Okay, this is hands down my favorite suggestion we got on social media because it is absolutely unhinged. Apparently, people in Rhode Island are sick of hearing that they are a part of New York State. Presumably, people are confusing it with Long Island? Staten Island? Okay, we have a lot of islands here, but Rhode is not one of them. I don't even know how to debunk this one, so I'm just gonna say it. Rhode Island, you're a part of New York now. Congratulations, and I'm sorry. Okay, bonus misconception. Rhode Island, it's not actually an island. There are some islands that make up its landmass though, mostly Aquidneck Island, which has most of Portsmouth, Middleton, and Newport on it. Pennsylvania is uniquely Amish. The name Pennsylvania Dutch could easily lead you to believe that A, Pennsylvania is full of Amish people, or B, it's the most Amish state in the country. Those claims range from dubious to debatable. With an Amish population of about 81,000 people, Pennsylvania is only about 0.6% Amish. That's about a fifth of the state's Puerto Rican population, for example. The unique Amish culture may have a disproportionate visibility in the state, but it's far from a significant portion of the population. A thornier question is whether Pennsylvania is the most Amish state in the country. On that front, it depends how you measure. The state does edge out Ohio for the largest Amish population in the country, but over the last decade, there were times where Ohio was reckoned to have a slightly higher total of Amish residents. Ohio's Holmes County has the single largest concentration of Amish people in any one county, not the more famous Lancaster County in Pennsylvania. Finally, Indiana actually has the largest percentage of residents belonging to an Amish community, with an estimated 0.9% of the state's total population being Amish. Incidentally, though they share some religious and cultural similarities, the Amish and Mennonites are not actually synonymous. And while there is a significant Mennonite population in Pennsylvania, there are actually more baptized members of the Mennonite Church in Africa than North America, due to missionary activity. And despite what I said at the start of this section and common usage, Pennsylvania Dutch and Amish also aren't actually synonymous. I'll get into that more in a future video we're making all about misconceptions about the Amish. If you know a myth about this interesting group, let us know in the comments. Oregon is blue through and through. The last time Oregon voted for the Republican candidate for president was 1984. So there's definitely some truth to this idea, though I will note that the state gave its electoral college votes to Eisenhower and Reagan twice, and Nixon 3 times, including his failed bid in 1960. But large swaths of the state are solidly conservative, especially in the least populated counties on the southern and eastern end of the states, some of which voted for Donald Trump by a dramatic 3-to-1 margin in the 2020 election. I don't want to make the mistake you sometimes see online, where an electoral map like this is shown to suggest that a state is more purple than it is. As of recording this video, it's still the case that people vote in elections, not land. And the people of Oregon as a whole definitely lean blue, but if your only sense of Oregon comes from Portlandia, you're probably mischaracterizing a large portion of the state. Oklahoma has a higher percentage of Native American citizens than any other state. This misconception largely hinges on the fact that Native American is a really broad label, debatably of limited value given the huge range of geographical and cultural diversity that fits under it. Still, if you had asked me before researching the script which state has the highest percentage of Native Americans in its total population, I probably would have said the Sooner State. After 1830's Indian Removal Act, tribe members from the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole nations were forcibly relocated to present-day Oklahoma, what was then known as Indian Territory. That's just one of many connections between native tribes in Oklahoma, though perhaps the most famous one. But Alaska actually has a considerably larger percentage of people from indigenous American populations. As you'd probably expect, given the great distance between Oklahoma and Alaska, the histories of the various indigenous populations are quite distinct, but some of the same power imbalances between the US government and native groups played out in both regions. In Alaska today, there are still a number of tribes, including Aleuts, Inupiat, Yupik, Athabascans, Tlingit, and Haida, making up about 15% of the state's population. Oklahoma has its own culturally rich and varied Native American population, and misconceptions about the tribes in the state abound. That actually might be a really cool future episode of this series. If you know any Native American YouTubers we might reach out to, drop their name in the comments below. Cleveland is Ohio's biggest city. Cleveland's got professional baseball, basketball, and football teams, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and an art museum with works by Botticelli, Van Gogh, and Jackson Pollock. But it's less than half the size of Columbus by population, and the gap is only growing. Cleveland hasn't been Ohio's most populous city since the 80s. At this point, it seems more likely that Cincinnati, the state's 3rd most populous city, will surpass Cleveland, rather than Cleveland retaking the top spot in Ohio. While Cleveland's population continues to shrink, Cincinnati's is growing, despite the existence of Skyline Chili. Ohio burn. Fargo takes place in North Dakota. The movie Fargo takes place, with the exception of one scene, in the state of Minnesota. The city Fargo is in North Dakota. What gives? The Coen brothers are from Minnesota and originally were set to call the movie Brainerd, where much of the action in their masterpiece takes place. As the filmmakers correctly deduced though, Brainerd does not sound like a cool film. Fargo does, and arguably invites some thematic interpretation. How far a journey the characters are going on, the depths of human venality, etc., etc. Note that I'm not basing this on anything the filmmakers said, but you know, far, go far, there's some meat on the bone. And the dialect the movie made famous, to the extent that it really exists anywhere, is more a product of the whole upper Midwest region than anything specific to North Dakota. Though, for what it's worth, you can find the film's infamous wood chipper in Fargo today. North Carolinians smoke 'em since they got 'em. North Carolina leads the country in terms of tobacco production with about twice as much output as its closest competitor, Kentucky. But that doesn't mean everyone in the Tar Heel state is constantly puffing or chewing away. North Carolina doesn't even crack the top 10 states in rates of cigarette smoking or smokeless tobacco use. Still, around 14,000 people in North Carolina die of smoking-related illnesses each year. Hopefully, these consumption numbers will decrease. New York is one big city. New York is not all subways and tall buildings, and it's definitely not all contained on one island at the bottom of the state. There are 4 cities of around 100,000 people or more north of this line, in fact. Buffalo is about half a day's drive from the city, but only half an hour away from Canada. Plenty of New York towns are closer to Montreal than any of the 5 boroughs. The state is home to tens of thousands of family farms. Not exactly Times Square. The landmass of Manhattan takes up around a 20th of 1% of the state's total area. And just to make things confusing, a sizable portion of New Yorkers will tell you that anything north of the city is upstate. New Mexico is part of Mexico. This one was also new to me, but apparently it's not uncommon for people from New Mexico to hear that they live in Mexico. You know, a different country altogether. Let's give people the benefit of the doubt and say that it's just the case of history buffs getting their timelines mixed up. The area that eventually became our 47th state once was part of Mexico, but in 1848 the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War, ceded most of the land to the United States. The rest of present-day New Mexico's land was acquired by the US some years later in what's often called the Gadsden Purchase. Or, you know, maybe people just hear the word Mexico and jump to erroneous conclusions. The mix-up is so common that New Mexico Magazine has a long-running monthly piece called "One of Our 50 is Missing," highlighting stories of this particular brand of geographical confusion. The Garden State is full of farmland. Businessman and politician Abraham Browning is sometimes credited with coining the Garden State nickname. In the late 1800s, when Browning is said to have come up with the moniker, it was apt. The state was roughly 2/3 farmland at the time. Today, though, a more fitting nickname might be the Vaccine State. The biggest industry in New Jersey is pharmaceuticals. Companies like Johnson & Johnson and Merck are based there. And though farming is still a major industry in Jersey, with high levels of cranberry, spinach, and bell pepper production, only around 15% of the state is taken up by farms today. New Hampshire is a tax-free state. New Hampshireites pay no state income tax on wages or sales tax, one of only 2 states in the country where that's true. If you know the other state, drop it in the comments below for 100 internet points and a tax deduction that will absolutely not withstand audit. New Hampshire's property taxes are among the top 10 highest in the country though. It all works out to an effective average tax burden of around 6.4% according to WalletHub, considerably lower than nearby Vermont, but higher than a handful of other states. It's typical for Nevadans to live on the Las Vegas Strip. When you hear someone lives in Nevada, especially if they're in Las Vegas, you might picture someone curling up to sleep in the shadow of the Paris Las Vegas's Eiffel Tower replica. The Las Vegas Strip may be iconic, but it's not a common spot to reside for Nevada's roughly 3 million residents. Around 75% of those people live in the greater Las Vegas area, but only a tiny percentage called the Strip home. Unfortunate note, a lot of the people that live on the Strip actually live under the Strip. Hundreds of unhoused people have taken temporary or even permanent residence in the storm tunnels underneath the city, where they can partially escape the city's oppressive heat. Nebraska is a flyover state. On one level, the phrase flyover state is just a bit of coastal elitism. It's not very cool to suggest any state is insignificant compared to population centers like New York or California. In the case of Nebraska, you've got cities like Omaha and Lincoln, beautiful nature like the Chimney Rock Formation, and unique culture, including Runzas, a kind of stuffed sandwich made with a yeasted bread dough that I would absolutely crush right now. But if we take the term flyover state a bit more literally, we could define it as states that you're more likely to literally fly over on the way to another destination as opposed to actually landing in the state. The travel company Champion Traveler analyzed hundreds of thousands of flights and came up with ratios of flights over to flights to in an attempt to quantify which states really are the most flown over. On that metric, Nebraska didn't crack the top 10 flyover states in the country. The clear winner, or loser, depending on how you look at it, was West Virginia, with almost 200 flights over the state for every one that landed there. No one survived the Battle of Little Bighorn. The Battle of Little Bighorn took place in what is now Montana, pitting the U.S. Army against members of various tribes of Native Americans. The fight ended in a rout for the Native Americans, which points to the most obvious way this misconception is false. Though the story is often told from the perspective of the U.S. Army, there were plenty of American Indian survivors of the battle. There was also, famously, an equine member of the U.S. Army who survived. Named Comanche, the horse ended up living out the rest of his days away from the battlefield. When he died, he was put on display at the Chicago Exposition of 1893. That is a choice. But what about soldiers from the U.S. Army? Did any of them survive? Lieutenant Colonel George Custer and the 5 companies under him all died, more than 200 men in total. But companies under Marcus A. Reno and Frederick W. Benteen, which had split off from Custer's men, did participate in the battle, and some of those soldiers did survive. There was also a pair of couriers, Daniel Kneep and John Martin, who were part of Custer's battalion, transmitting messages to different battalions. When the writing was on the wall, Captain Benteen was said to have held the messengers back, preventing their deaths. Though, I should say, recent scholarship has questioned Kneep's story. Many people later claimed to be survivors who had fought directly under Custer that day. Most of those claims were definitively debunked, but one, that of Frank Finkel, remains contentious to this day. Finkel didn't come forward with his story until 1920, and some of the details involving name changes and falsified places of birth are a bit suspicious. Other facts he offered up, though, from the type of horse he rode to his recollection of the terrain, did seem to match up with what a real survivor would have known. Missouri doesn't exist. The website Sporkle has a bunch of addictive quizzes on it. This is not an ad, by the way. I just like wasting time online in a way that does not crush my will to live. One of those quizzes asks people to list the 50 states against the ticking clock. Over millions of attempts, the most commonly forgotten state on that quiz is Missouri, with nearly a quarter of players forgetting about the show me state. Before you feel too superior to those Missouri agnostics, name the 7 other US states that start with an M. Go, now. Illiteracy is spelled M-I-S-S-I-S-S-I-P-P-I. People in Mississippi are sick of hearing about how they can't read. And for what it's worth, they're not in the top 5 states in adult illiteracy. According to World Population Review, California and New York, 2 states generally not saddled with stereotypes about their purported stupidity, have the lowest mid to high literacy rates in the country, partially due to the relatively high number of immigrants living there who don't speak English as a first language. To the extent that Mississippi, like a lot of other states in our country, is facing a challenge with low levels of literacy, it's not really something to laugh about. Adult literacy is the function of many interrelated factors. To name just a few, socioeconomic status, family situation, and whether you're a native speaker or learning a second language, especially if you're measuring illiteracy specifically in English, as states in the US often do. Low literacy is associated with poorer employment prospects, higher incarceration rates, and health issues, from increased stress to problems with taking medication as directed. Minnesota is Canada's southernmost province. When people refer to Minnesota as Canada's 11th province, they're generally just having some fun with the similarities between the state and its neighbor to the north. Many parts of Canada, especially the prairie provinces, have a similar climate to the Gopher State, so it's no surprise that they share cultural touchstones like ice fishing and hockey. According to our social media respondents, though, it's not too rare for a Minnesotan to genuinely get misidentified as a Canadian. I don't think pointing out that Minnesota is part of the United States is very illuminating. So let me share one particularly odd part of the cross-country relationship. After the American Revolution, diplomats tried to set the border between British Canada and what would soon become the United States of America. They intended to draw a straight line due west between the northwest corner of the Lake of the Woods and the Mississippi River. The problem, as Ken Jennings explained in a 2018 piece for Condé Nast Traveler, no such straight line exists. The Mississippi is south of where the border makers had thought. Fast forward a few decades, after the Louisiana Purchase, a new border was drawn between the two countries. It led to a geographical oddity that persists today. A little chunk of the United States, known as the Northwest Angle, is connected only to Canada, not to any land belonging to the United States. The Angle, as it's often called by locals, is home to only a few dozen Americans, each of whom lives a pretty particular life. For students who go to school elsewhere in Minnesota, it's not uncommon to cross the US-Canada border 4 times in a single day. They leave their homes in Minnesota, pass into Manitoba, then back into Minnesota to get to class in the mornings, with the reverse trip at the end of the day. Michigan is one big mitten. In 2009, the Michigan House of Representatives unanimously passed the bill requiring any illustration, image, or depiction of the state of Michigan made by the government to include both the lower and upper peninsula. The UP, as it's often called, is connected to the rest of the state by the nearly 5-mile-long Mackinac Bridge. Bonus misconception, it's not pronounced Mackinac. Only an absolute fool would call it Mackinac. Fort Mackinac, Michigan. Joke's on you, Justin, of 2 years ago, for I was merely playing the long game. Idiot. Anyway, if it sounds like an odd thing for a state legislature to write into law, or a minor mistake to fixate on for 2 full calendar years, you're right on both counts. And in both cases, experience was the greatest teacher. Michiganders are sick and tired of people forgetting about a big chunk of their state. A Google office in Ann Arbor left the UP off a piece of wall art depicting the state. A graphic made by Mountain Dew, or more likely an overworked social media manager, labeled it as part of Wisconsin. Back in 2020, a misinfographic on Sean Hannity's show went ahead and ceded the Upper Peninsula to Canada for good measure. The UP's population has been dropping for years, but there are still about 300,000 Upers, most of whom we can guess would prefer not to be wiped off the map or summarily reassigned to Ontario. Massachusetts is not a state. Perhaps you've heard a precocious youngster speak up when the state of Massachusetts comes up. Actually, the knowledge-loving little one says, it's not a state, it's a commonwealth. That hypothetical kid, who is definitely not me as a 7-year-old, has half a point, but he's ultimately wrong. As the State Library of Massachusetts explains on mass.gov, commonwealths are states, but the reverse is not true. It's one of those all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares kind of deals. In the case of Massachusetts, Kentucky, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, their status as commonwealths just reflects the language used in their state constitutions. There isn't any legal distinction between a commonwealth and a state, and it's accurate to use either label when discussing them. For that matter, Puerto Rico is also called a commonwealth, and it doesn't mean much in that context either. For legal purposes, it's more relevant that the island is considered a territory. Theoretically, Puerto Rico could one day become a state, cease being a territory, and continue being a commonwealth. Maryland is part of the South. 65% of state residents who responded to a Goucher College poll said they consider Maryland to be a northern state. The real misconception here, though, might be forcing Maryland into a southern or northern box. The state's history and present seem to defy such categorization. The state is below the Mason-Dixon line, often considered the dividing line between North and South. At the outset of the American Civil War, it was a so-called slave state, permitting the abhorrent practice, but it never seceded from the Union, despite some efforts to do so. Thousands of Marylanders fought on either side of the war, sometimes against one another. The US Census Bureau considers Maryland part of the South, but I personally prefer the definition offered up by Malice Toward None 1 on Reddit. It is neither South nor North. Maryland is considered a semi-autonomous crab republic. Lobster is greater than lager in Maine. Maine is famous for its lobster. The industry contributes around $1 billion to the state's economy and supports thousands of jobs, including around 4,800 commercial lobstermen. But as the most heavily forested state in the country, Maine actually created much more economic output from logging and related industries. Paper manufacturing alone contributed to nearly 5,000 jobs in 2019, with logging and related trucking activity also representing important economic engines in the state. Cajun and Creole are synonymous. Louisiana is home to some rich culture, from jazz music to Mardi Gras. It's also steeped in history, some of which has led to confusion in the present day. Is there a difference between the labels Cajun and Creole, and if so, what is it? Both terms are associated with the people and culture of Louisiana, and they're often used pretty interchangeably. Since there's no universally accepted definition of the word Creole, it can be tough to pin down. But looking at the history of the term suggests there is a meaningful distinction to make. Cajun came about as a variation on Acadian, a word describing the people from the French colony of Acadia centered on present-day Nova Scotia. These settlers started arriving in Louisiana in the mid to late 1700s and initially embraced the Creole designation. It came from the Spanish word criollo and originally referred to someone in a given area, such as the Louisiana colony, who was of predominantly European descent but born in the colony. Today, somewhat confusingly, Creole is often used to refer to people of more than one race or ethnicity, often people with a mix of white European and black African heritage. Sometimes it's applied as a catch-all term for anyone from the Caribbean. When the word Creole started to be used in Louisiana, it generally implied that a person was French-speaking and of the Catholic faith, but it didn't have the racial connotation that would later come to the fore. According to the historic New Orleans collection, one could be of entirely European, entirely African, or of mixed ancestry and still be a Creole. After the Civil War, Jim Crow laws forced the region's diverse population into a black-white framework that flattened more complicated familial histories. As Herman Fuselier, a specialist in Creole culture, told the historic New Orleans collection, with some white Creoles, when they learned the word could be connected to blacks, they dropped the term. Cajun, which had once had a neutral if not derogatory connotation, was increasingly embraced, especially in the southern areas of the state that had been the center of the historic Francophone culture. In 1971, the state legislature recognized 22 of Louisiana's 64 parishes under the newly created name of Acadiana, a nod to that French settler history. Today, it's difficult to say if there are any hard and fast rules for defining Cajun versus Creole. Generally, Cajun is applied to white Louisianans in the more rural southern parts of the state, while Creole often refers to black or mixed race people, especially in and around New Orleans. Creole food is sometimes said to include more diverse cultural influences and, more specifically, tomatoes and tomato-based sauces. Cajun food, on the other hand, is sometimes described as more rustic fare, perhaps with clearer lines back to its French Acadian origins. Still, Cajun cuisine's unmissable African and Native American influences belie any effort to oversimplify this tricky cultural distinction. All bourbon comes from Kentucky. I can already feel the angry comments pouring in from the bluegrass state. To be clear, Kentucky is definitely bourbon country. 95% of all bourbon is made there, according to the Kentucky Distillers Association. But 95% is not, if my math is correct, 100%. And that's because there are no rules saying that all bourbon must be produced in Kentucky. Even the more subtle version of the mandate, which says that you can make bourbon in Kentucky but not label it as such, is untrue. As Dana McMahon wrote for Louisville's Courier Journal, the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau's Beverage Alcohol Manual defines bourbon as whiskey produced in the U.S. at not exceeding 80% alcohol by volume, 160 proof, from a fermented mash of not less than 51% corn and stored at not more than 62.5% alcohol by volume, 125 proof, in charred new oak containers. No mention of Kentucky. Today, you can sample smaller batch bourbon, labeled bourbon, make believe rules be damned, like New Mexico's Left Turn Distilling, Colorado's Breckenridge Distillery, and New York's Black Button Distilling, Hill Rock Estate, and Taconic Distillery. One of the country's biggest bourbon producers is MGP of Indiana, located in, you guessed it, Lexington, Kentucky. It's Indiana. Kansas City is the biggest city in Kansas. More than 500,000 people live in Kansas City. So how is Wichita, with a population of about 400,000, Kansas's most populous city? It's a classic case of having fun with municipal boundaries, a beloved pastime amongst our nation's youth. Don't fact check that. Kansas City exists in 2 states at once. The one that's in Missouri is about 3 times as populated as the Kansas City in Kansas. If that seems strange, some history will clear things up. Kansas City, Missouri actually predates the state of Kansas. Both take their names from the Kansas River, which got it from the Kanza people, now usually called the Kaw Nation, as John Elligan laid out in a piece for the New York Times. A couple decades after the state was established, a number of smaller Kansas towns united to form Kansas City, Kansas. At the time, the city in Missouri was still known as the City of Kansas. Not exactly the same thing. Today, residents of Kansas City, Kansas have a nickname to differentiate themselves from their interstate counterparts. Because their city is in Wyandotte County, they sometimes call themselves Dots. Adorable. Iowa is flatter than a corn pancake. If you picture Iowa as miles of cornfields extending out in all directions, you're ignoring large parts of the Hawkeye State. To be sure, parts of the state can be quite flat, and even where it's not, we're talking rolling hills, not huge mountains. The state's highest point is the less than staggering Hawkeye Point, nearly 1,700 feet above sea level. But Iowa's lowest hills region is, well, hilly, as are some of the areas in the southern part of the state. In fact, when a group of researchers from the University of Kansas set out to quantify the flattest states in the contiguous US, Iowa came in at number 18, less flat than about 1/3 of the states in the country. For the record, Florida was dubbed the flattest. Yes, we finally won something. Indiana is sparsely populated. When you picture Indiana, you might think of big farms with relatively few people. Or maybe your mind conjures up images of the Rust Belt, factory towns that are now deserted and lifeless. You might not realize that Indiana is actually the 17th most populous state in the country. Only 8 states have any cities within them bigger than Indianapolis. And while farming is definitively a big part of the Hoosier state's economy, the Rust Belt hasn't quite rusted over everywhere. Indiana has been the country's biggest steel producer for more than 4 decades. It's responsible for about 1/4 of US steel production. Deep dish is the standard Illinois pizza order. Deep dish pizza has been picked up by national chains and celebrated by Chicago mayors, but the more common choice for locals is probably a thin crust pizza cut into squares, often called tavern style or party style pizza. Chicago-based food writer Kevin Pang went so far as to call deep dish tourist food. Not that tourist food can't be delicious, but it's a dish most Chicagoans stay away from. That might be a slight exaggeration. It's hard to imagine tourists alone could keep dozens of Lou Malnati's locations in the Chicagoland area alive, for example, but the numbers are pretty persuasive. According to ordering data compiled by Grubhub, deep dish and stuffed Chicago pizza account for only about 9% of all pizza orders in Chicago. It's harder to find data statewide, but it seems like a safe bet that Chicago deep dish is going to be substantially more popular in the rest of Illinois. Anecdotally, the rather passionate comments on Pang's piece in The Takeout suggest that deep dish is a beloved part of Chicago cuisine, but more of a special occasion meal than a weekly dinner option. I personally think the whole New York versus Chicago pizza thing is a bit played out. I have gone on the record saying I prefer Detroit-style pizza, but I do want to point out one more thing about pizza in Chicago. Apparently, a lot of places will deliver your pizza not in the classic cardboard box, but in a bag. Ooh, I cannot justify this feeling, but that makes me kind of uncomfortable. Potatoes are Idaho's biggest agricultural product. In Idaho, potatoes are no small potatoes. I won't ever apologize for that, please do not ask. The Gem State is responsible for almost 1/3 of our country's tater production, generating about $1 billion per year. But the dairy and beef industries each generate considerably more money. In terms of acreage planted, wheat accounts for over 3 times as much land as potatoes. The growing livestock industry also has contributed to the growth of hay as a cash crop. According to the USDA's 2021 State Agriculture Overview, hay and haylage, another form of grass used to feed animals, narrowly surpass potatoes for total monetary value of production. A majority of Hawaiians voted for statehood. In June 1959, voters in Hawaii participated in what's called a plebiscite, a direct vote, in this case on the question of whether or not the territory should become a state. With 132,773 votes in favor of statehood and only about 8,000 opposed, Hawaii soon became the country's 50th state. So, where's the misconception? Well, according to the 1960 census, Hawaii had a population of a little over 630,000. Even if we knock off a few thousand for population growth between the vote and census and assume that as much as half of the population wasn't of voting age, it seems pretty safe to assume that more than 50% of Hawaiians didn't vote in the election at all. In an op-ed for the Honolulu Star-Advertiser, a group in favor of Hawaiian sovereignty estimated that only around 27% of voters actually voted yes in the plebiscite. And the controversy goes beyond turnout. Hawaii's Caucasian population exploded from around 29,000 in 1900 to over 200,000 by 1960, meaning many of the voters in that referendum didn't have long-standing ties to the islands. Voters were only required to have lived in Hawaii for 1 year in order to vote. And the history that led to those transplants ending up in Hawaii is fraught, to say the least, including what many considered the illegal deposition of Queen Liliuokalani in 1898. In 1993, President Bill Clinton actually signed an official resolution apologizing for overthrowing the sovereign government of Hawaii. It's a fascinating, often troubling history. Georgia is the Big Peach. There are dozens of streets in Atlanta with the word Peachtree in their names. Baseball legend Ty Cobb was known as the Georgia Peach. The Georgia Film Office incorporates a peach in that logo that gets slapped on the end of all those Marvel movies. These guys like their peaches, but the fruit is not Georgia's biggest crop. That would be cotton. And while Georgia is the biggest producer of peanuts and pecans in the country, it isn't the #1 peach producer. It's actually third, behind California and South Carolina. Interesting, if slightly speculative side note, according to Georgia Public Broadcasting, all of those Peachtree streets are actually named after the Peachtree Creek, not peach trees. And that name might be a mistranslation of a Cherokee word. It may be the case that all those streets are supposed to be called Peachtree. Florida Man is a reflection of Floridian character. As a usually proud Florida man whose trivia team name is in fact Florida Man, I feel like I might have some insight on this one. Florida definitely has its fair share of eccentrics and face eaters, though at least one of those face eaters was incorrectly identified as a bath salts user, as we covered in Misconceptions about drugs. But I think there are a couple of interesting factors that suggest that isn't Floridians' innate instability that led to all those Florida Man headlines. First, Florida has the third highest population of any state. With about 22 times the number of residents as Delaware, for example, it stands to reason that there are more opportunities for something outlandish to happen in the state. Florida also has one of the most robust public records laws in the nation, as Gil Smart wrote for Treasure Coast newspapers. The press, in general, has uncommonly easy access to arrest records and associated media, including video footage, which, unfortunately, does not include a man pausing his attempt to evade the police in order to steal a refreshing Capri Sun. Something which actually happened in the Sunshine State. Florida's violent crime rate is almost exactly on par with the national average. It's a bit tougher to find stats about crimes involving people who run illegal snake racing operations out of their basements or whatever odd activities define that special Florida man feeling. But I'm inclined to think there's a healthy dose of confirmation bias perpetuating the Florida man archetype. Incorporating in Delaware means other states' laws don't apply. Relatively small Delaware is the legal home to more publicly traded companies than any other state. It also leads the country in out-of-state incorporations, in which a company has headquarters in one place but incorporates in another. In fact, over 200,000 businesses list the address of a single office building in Wilmington as their official incorporation location. It's safe to assume that there are some business-friendly rules behind these overwhelming trends. But if you operate a business in California, say uninsured Jimmy's Trampoline Park and Bar, any lawsuits that might arise don't get magically moved to Delaware's jurisdiction just because you incorporated there. If there's a legal dispute amongst the company's shareholders, though, that would be adjudicated in Delaware. And the state has relatively permissive privacy laws regarding incorporation. I'm guessing that, and not the beauty of Rehoboth Beach, is what attracted drug lord El Chapo, Ponzi scheme convict Tim Durham, and Russian illegal arms dealer Victor Bout to incorporate companies in the state. Everyone in Connecticut is wealthy. When people associate Connecticut with big bucks, they're probably thinking about towns like New Canaan or maybe Darien, where the median household income surpasses $200,000. The state is definitely on the wealthier end of the spectrum, though for what it's worth, several states do have a higher median household income. But the Nutmeg State is more than just a few wealthy towns. Its Gini coefficient, one way of measuring income or wealth inequality, is among the top 5 in the country. In the capital city, Hartford, almost a third of the population is living under the poverty line. According to Feeding America, a nonprofit organization fighting food insecurity, nearly 100,000 children in Connecticut face hunger. That's 1 in every 8 kids. So while some people in the state are doing very well financially, it's incorrect to assume everyone in Connecticut is rich. Colorado is the highest state. Colorado has the highest average elevation of any state, though Alaska has the highest peaks in the country, including Denali, the USA's tallest mountain. But the misconception I would like to address is that everyone in Colorado is high on marijuana. And you can tell I know what I'm talking about because I just used the phrase high on marijuana. The state was the first to establish a legal recreational cannabis market, but in terms of per capita usage, it's edged out by Oregon. And even that relatively high usage doesn't mean everyone is consuming. About 28% of Colorado adults reported using the drug within the last year. Colorado doesn't have the most marijuana dispensaries in the country either. That distinction belongs to Oklahoma, of all places, whose fairly free-reign medical marijuana program has led to over 2,000 dispensaries in the state. California's beaches are perfect for swimming. You've probably heard that people in Los Angeles can surf and ski all on the same day. Though given the intense traffic you're likely to hit, that might be its own misconception. But even if you're willing to brave the 10 at rush hour, you might be disappointed to learn that California beaches do not have particularly warm water temperatures. That's to be expected in the northern part of the state. Crescent City's latitude is about the same as Chicago, for example. But even down in San Diego, ocean temperatures rarely peak into the 70s. In Santa Cruz, they're usually in the mid-50s. Jennifer Skeen explained the phenomenon succinctly in a piece for KQED. First, the California current brings cold water from Alaska southward along the coast. And second, cold water from the deep ocean comes up to the surface through a process called upwelling. That means summer ocean temperatures off the coast of Los Angeles are generally more in line with those found in Boston than in Myrtle Beach, even though the South Carolina resort destination is located at a similar latitude to LA. It's illegal to mispronounce Arkansas. Arkansas Code 104105 declares that confusion has arisen in the pronunciation of the name of our state, and it is deemed important that the true pronunciation should be determined for use in oral official proceedings. That's led some people to say that it's illegal to mispronounce the state's name. But that resolution is really just about clarifying the pronunciation and maybe getting some free press. No one's getting thrown in jail for calling it Arkansas. Arizona is home to the world's deepest canyon. Arizona is home to one of the most iconic natural landmarks in the country, the Grand Canyon. And though many believe it's the world's deepest canyon, it's not even the deepest in the United States. The Grand Canyon ranges from 4,000 to 6,000 feet deep, with an average depth of approximately 5,280 feet, or 1 mile. The deepest canyon in the United States is the aptly named Hell's Canyon, located on the border between Oregon and Idaho. It has a depth of approximately 8,000 feet. The deepest canyon in the world may be the Yarlung Zangbo Canyon in Tibet, with a maximum depth of 17,490 feet. Alaska is a year-round winter wonderland. While Alaska holds the record for the lowest temperature ever recorded in the United States, the picture of the whole state as a never-ending snow-blanketed landscape is not accurate. Sure, the average highest temperatures in some northern Alaska cities max out around the mid-40s, but the state's weather varies drastically by region. Alaska's interior region averages around 70 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer, and temperatures can often fluctuate into the 90s. Alaska actually reached a record high of 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer of 1915. The University of Alabama mostly teaches Alabamans. About 42% of the students at the University of Alabama are considered Alabama residents. Recruiting done by the school's famous sports program contributes to that imbalance. So does an apparent effort to attract out-of-state students who pay considerably higher tuition than in-state residents. According to a 2019 report conducted by researchers from UCLA and the University of Arizona, UA made over 10 times more school visits to out-of-state high schools compared to schools in its own state. The university argued that school recruiting visits are just one piece of the outreach pie, but it's hard to argue with the researchers' data. In the 15 years between 2003 and 2018, the number of non-resident freshmen at Alabama nearly quadrupled. Washington, D.C.'s traffic circles were built for defense. Washington, D.C. is obviously not a state, but we have a hunch that D.C. residents might be miffed if we left it off this list. The capital has a lot of traffic circles for a U.S. city, which some sources have said were originally meant to house cannons to defend against enemy cavalry. That is not the case. Pierre Charles L'Enfant was a French-born architect who fought alongside Americans during the Revolutionary War. In the aftermath, George Washington turned to him to design a new capital city along the Potomac River. The National Mall and Capitol Hill are just two of the many parts of the city that are still marked with his fingerprints. L'Enfant actually initially envisioned the traffic circles as squares, with each one representing a different state of the Union. Informal state embassies would be built nearby, and residents from the corresponding state would live in the surrounding area. That plan never quite came to be, but the traffic circles, sometimes maddening for drivers, but often prized by locals, continue to be an important part of the city today. Thanks for watching this episode of Misconceptions. If you happen to live in a different country and felt a little left out, here's your chance. We have an upcoming episode covering one misconception from every country in the United Nations. Drop a suggestion in the comments below for a chance to be featured in that episode, and we'll see you next time.